Christmas Eve, 1877. The snow had been falling since before dawn, straight down, no wind, each flake small and deliberate, as if the sky itself had decided that today was not a day for chaos. Today was a day for covering things up, for burying what needed to stay buried, for making the world look clean when it was anything but. The stagecoach from Denver rolled into Pine Ridge just past 2 in the afternoon, its wheels grinding through 6 inches of fresh powder, the horses blowing steam from their nostrils in great white clouds. The driver had not spoken a single word since the last way station. Neither had the other passengers, an old trapper heading back to his claim, and a married couple who had argued quietly for the first 3 hours and then simply stopped as if they had run out of words entirely. Wren Whitfield had not spoken either. She had sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the window, watching Colorado Territory swallow everything she had ever known, mile by mile, ridge by ridge, until Boston felt less like a city she had left behind and more like something she had dreamed once and could no longer fully remember. She was 20 years old. She looked younger in the face and older in the eyes, which is the combination that happens to people who have spent too many years being afraid. Her hair was the color of winter wheat, pale gold, almost silver in certain light, and she had pinned it back as neatly as she could manage after 2 days on the road. Those strands had come loose around her temples, and she had long since stopped trying to fix them. Her traveling dress was navy blue wool, the finest thing she owned, though the hem had collected the dust of 3 territories, and the fabric carried the exhaustion of someone who had slept sitting upright for 48 hours. At her throat, pinned with care that had become habit, was a small ivory cameo. Her mother's, the only piece of her old life she had allowed herself to carry. In her lap sat a carpet bag. Inside it, one change of clothes, a Greek Bible that had belonged to her father, $20, she had taken from Silas Drummond's desk drawer over the course of 14 months, never more than $1 at a time, hidden in the hem of a petticoat, slow and careful as a woman building her escape brick by invisible brick. $20. That was what 3 years of captivity had purchased her. That and a one-way ticket into a man she had never met, in a territory she had never seen, arranged by a nun, who had looked her in the eye and said simply, "This is your way out. Take it or leave it. But if you leave it, I cannot promise you will have another." Sister Honora had not been cruel when she said it. She had been honest. There is a kindness in honesty when it comes from someone who has nothing to gain from it. Wren had taken it. She thought about Sister Honora now as the stagecoach lurched to a stop, and the driver called out Pine Ridge in a voice that suggested he had been saying that word for so many years it had lost all meaning. She thought about the nun's careful hands folding a letter she would not let Wren read before sealing it. She thought about the words Sister Honora had said instead. "I have written to a man named Cormac Calloway. He is a good man. He lost his wife some years ago and he has lived alone since. I told him I had a young woman in need of mountain air for her health. He agreed to take you in for the winter." Wren had understood immediately. The letter was a lie, a careful, well-intentioned, necessary lie. She had asked, "What if he is not the man you believe him to be?" Sister Honora had looked at her with gray eyes that had seen enough of the world to be neither romantic nor cynical about it, just clear. "Then you will have traded one danger for another," she had said, "but at least this danger will be one you walk toward with your eyes open. That is worth something. That is in fact worth quite a great deal." The door of the stagecoach swung open. Cold hit Wren like a flat hand against the face, sharp, immediate, honest, in the way that extreme cold always is. She stood from her seat, took her bag, and stepped down onto the running board and then into the snow. And for a moment she simply stood there, looking at Pine Ridge. It was a small town, one main street, a general store with a covered porch, a white clapboard church, a saloon with lamplight already burning in the windows despite the early hour, a boarding house with a hand-painted sign and a scattering of homes behind each one trailing smoke from its chimney. Snow covered everything in a smooth, undisturbed layer that made the whole place look like a painting rather than somewhere real people actually lived. Wren breathed in. The air tasted like pine and cold stone and something woodsy underneath that she had no name for. Nothing like Boston, nothing like anything she had known before. For one suspended moment, she felt something she had not felt in 3 years. Not happiness, exactly. Not safety. Something quieter than both. The stillness that comes when running is finally over before whatever comes next has had the chance to begin. Then she heard his voice. "You the woman coming up to the Calloway place?" She turned. The man standing at the edge of the street was lean and weathered, somewhere between 40 and 50, with pale eyes that caught the gray afternoon light and gave nothing back. He wore buckskin and a heavy coat, and he carried himself with the unhurried ease of a man who had learned long ago that most situations resolve themselves in his favor if he simply waits. He had a rifle on his back, and his hands were loose at his sides, which should have read as casual but did not. Nothing about this man read as casual. Everything about him read as calculation dressed up in patience. His name, she would learn later, was Boyd Reardon. But she did not know that yet. What she knew immediately, in the way that the body understands things the mind is still working to form into language, was that she did not want to be alone in a conversation with this man. "I am," she said. She kept her voice level. She had learned in the years with Silas Drummond that showing fear to certain kinds of men was the same as handing them a weapon. Boyd Reardon looked at her the way a man looks at something he is considering purchasing. Not with desire exactly, with assessment, with the quiet arithmetic of someone calculating value and cost. "You ought to think carefully about that," he said. "The Calloway brothers, they ain't natural. 3 men living up on that mountain alone all these years, sharing everything." He let the word hang in the cold air between them. "Ain't a decent woman in this territory who'd go up there knowing what she was going to." Wren held his gaze. "Then it's fortunate I didn't ask for your opinion." Something shifted in his pale eyes, not anger, something more controlled than anger, the recalculation of a man who has just been denied something he expected. He opened his mouth to speak again. He did not get the chance. "Reardon," one word, said quietly. The way a man says a word when he is accustomed to not having to say it twice. Wren turned toward the voice and felt the world rearrange itself in ways she had not prepared for. 3 men stood at the far end of the street. She registered their size first because it was impossible to register anything else first. Each of them stood well over 6 feet broad through the shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with years of physical labor performed at altitude in unforgiving terrain. They wore heavy coats and work boots dark with wet, and they stood with a stillness that was somehow more commanding than movement. The kind of stillness that comes not from restraint, but from the complete absence of anything to prove. Their faces were nearly identical. Same strong jaw, same lines around the eyes, from squinting into sun and snow. Same chestnut brown hair, gone slightly longer than fashionable. Same amber eyes, warm like whiskey, held up to a candle flame, that were all 6 of them looking directly at her. The one in the middle spoke. "I believe you have business elsewhere." Boyd Reardon looked at the 3 of them. Whatever he saw in their faces, and it must have been something, made him take one long, measured look at Wren, the kind of look that is meant to be remembered, and then he turned and walked away without another word. His boots left clean holes in the snow as he went. The silence he left behind felt enormous. The man who had spoken stepping forward. He moved with the economy of someone who had learned to navigate the world carefully, not because he lacked confidence, but because he was aware always of the space he occupied. He stopped a few feet from her, and the space between them felt both very small and very large at once. "Miss Whitfield." His voice was low, measured with a rasp at the edges that suggested it was not used for unnecessary things. "I am Cormac Calloway." He offered his hand. She took it. His palm was warm despite the cold, the skin calloused and rough from work, and his grip was gentle in the careful way of someone who knows their own strength and is actively choosing not to use it. "Mr. Calloway," she was proud of how steady her voice came out. "Thank you for having me." He looked at her for a moment in a way that was not rude, but was entirely direct, as if he had decided that politeness and honesty were different things, and he had chosen honesty. "You are not what I expected," he said quietly. Before she could decide what to do with that, the man to his right stepped forward. "Rafe Calloway," he said. His voice was rougher than Cormac's, less measured. Where Cormac gave the impression of a fire burning behind glass contained controlled. Banked, this one gave the impression of the same barrier with the glass removed. He was looking at her with an intensity that was not unkind, but was entirely unguarded. The youngest of the 3, depending on how you count it. "You cannot count it any other way," said the third, stepping up beside them. "I am Thad." He had the same face as his brothers, the same massive frame, but something in his eyes was different, quieter. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand rather than simply react to. We are glad you made the journey. It is a long way from Boston. Wren looked from one face to the next and felt the ground shift beneath her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the snow. Sister Honora's letter had said a man named Cormac Calloway, one man, a widower living alone in need of company. There was not one man standing in front of her. There were three men with the same face and the same eyes, and the same way of holding their bodies in the cold, all of them looking at her like she was something they had been waiting for without having let themselves admit it. She understood in that moment what Boyd Reardon had been trying to tell her at the edge of the street. She also understood with a clarity that surprised her that Boyd Reardon was not a man who warned women out of concern for their welfare. "We should get moving," Cormac said. He had been watching her face. She had the impression he missed very little. "The trail is 7 miles and the light will go by 4. Can you ride?" She had ridden twice in her life, both times as a child, both times without distinction. "I can learn," she said. Something changed in Cormac's expression. Not quite a smile, the suggestion of one like a word someone almost says and then decides to keep for later. "Yes," he said, "I believe you can." The ride up the mountain took 2 hours. There is no way to adequately describe what 2 hours on horseback at altitude does to a person who has spent the last 3 years living in a city house with locked doors and controlled meals, and a universe that extended no further than the walls Silas Drummond had decided she was allowed to inhabit. The mountain was enormous. Immovable? Indifferent to her in the way that large natural things are indifferent, not hostile, simply vast, operating on timescales that made human suffering feel briefly and mercifully small. The pines rose on either side of the trail, their branches bowed under snow that had accumulated for days, and every so often a branch would release its load with a soft, percussive thump, and the world would rearrange slightly and continue. The air got thinner as they climbed. Each breath burned a little. Her thighs ached from gripping the saddle. Her fingers went numb inside her gloves. She did not say a word about any of it. Cormac rode beside her close enough to intervene if she began to slip far enough to give her the dignity of managing on her own. He pointed out the trail markers without being asked. He told her when a section was steep and when it would ease. He did not offer unnecessary reassurance, and he did not talk simply to fill silence. And Wren, who had spent 3 years surrounded by a man who used words as instruments of control, found this more comforting than she would have expected. Rafe rode ahead, occasionally disappearing around bends in the trail, and then reappearing, checking for something Wren could not identify. Thad rode behind. At one point when the trail narrowed and Wren's horse, patient bay mare named Lucy, who seemed to understand that her rider was operating on nerve alone, stepped sideways toward the edge. Thad was there before she had time to register the danger. One hand steady and unhurried on Lucy's flank, the mare settled. They continued. "You are doing well," Thad said from behind her. "I am not," she said, honestly, "but I am still here." He was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes that is the same thing." The cabin appeared when the last gray light was just beginning to fail. It sat in a clearing ringed by pines so tall they seemed to be holding the sky up, built from dark weathered logs that looked as if they had grown from the mountain rather than been cut from it. The roof was steeply pitched and heavy with snow. A stone chimney rose from one end, and from it came a thin straight line of smoke that meant someone had banked a fire before leaving that morning. Wren looked at it for a moment before anyone helped her down. It was not what she had imagined. She was not sure what she had imagined, something rougher perhaps, something that looked more like desperation. But this cabin looked like something built by men who intended to stay, who had made a decision about where they were going to live, and then committed to that decision with every log and every stone, and iron in every hand-fitted joint. There was no decoration, nothing ornamental, but there was care in the construction that she recognized because her father had taught her to look for it. Care is not the same thing as beauty, he had said once, but it outlasts beauty by considerable distance. Cormac lifted her from the saddle with hands that completely spanned her waist and set her on the ground. And when her legs buckled slightly from the long ride, he steadied her without comment and without letting go until she nodded that she was all right. "Welcome," he said. The word was simple. He did not embellish it. She followed them inside. The main room was larger than she expected. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, its mouth wide enough to burn logs the length of a man's arm. And though the fire had burned down to coals, it still put out a heat that hit her the moment she crossed the threshold. A plank table stood near the window with 3 chairs. A kitchen area in the corner held a cast-iron stove, shelves of provisions, a water bucket, and a set of tin cups hanging from hooks. A bookshelf leaned against one wall. She read the spines quickly, as she had always done: Thoreau Whitman, a worn Bible, a manual on livestock management, a battered almanac for 1874. Not uneducated men. She noticed that too. What she noticed most, though, what her eyes went to before she could redirect them, was the doorway on the left side of the room and the name carved into the wooden beam above it. Ivy. The letters were precise, carefully cut, the kind of work that takes time and intention. Not a name scratched in haste, a name preserved. The room beyond the doorway was dark. Cormac followed her gaze. His jaw tightened once and then went still. The way a man's face goes still when he has been practicing a particular kind of stillness for years and has gotten very good at it. That was our wife's room, he said. He did not correct himself or explain the pronoun. He simply meant it. It has been empty for 8 years. We cleaned it for you. We hope you will be comfortable there. He turned before she could respond and began building the fire back up with the focused efficiency of a man who has learned to treat silence as productive. Thad appeared at her elbow with her carpet bag. "Let me show you," he said. The room was small. A narrow bed against the wall, its frame built from the same dark timber as the rest of the cabin, covered with a mattress and a quilt pieced in blue and gray. A dresser with an oil lamp and a small mirror. A shelf on the wall still holding glass jars of dried herbs gone gray with age, their labels written in a hand Wren did not recognize. In the corner, a wicker sewing basket, its lid closed, a fine layer of dust on the handle. And on the wall beside the single window, hung from a nail by a strip of thin leather, a small cross carved from cedar wood. Unfinished. The surface smooth on most sides but rough along one edge, the way something looks when the person who was making it stopped before they were done. Everything in this room had belonged to someone else. Wren stood in the middle of it and felt for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach the full weight of what she had agreed to. Thad set her bag on the bed. "We didn't move much," he said. "Ivy's things. If you want anything removed, you say so. It won't offend us." "How did she die?" Wren asked. The question came out before she could stop it. She had not planned to ask it, not yet, not this soon. But it was there in the room, in the unfinished cross and the closed sewing basket and the name carved above the door, and she had never been good at ignoring the things that filled a room most. Thad's face changed, not dramatically, a slight shift around the eyes, a new quality in the stillness. "That is Cormac's story to tell," he said carefully. "But I will tell you this, her death nearly broke us, all 3 of us, and not a day has passed in 8 years that we have not wondered if there was something we could have done differently." He left her with that. Wren sat down on the edge of the bed, still wearing her coat and gloves, and listened to the sounds from the other side of the thin wall. The fire crackling, the scrape of a pot being moved on the stove. Low voices she could hear but not fully make out. The sounds of men who have lived together for a long time and no longer need to narrate what they are doing. She thought about Sister Honora, about the way the nun had looked at her across the narrow table in the convent kitchen, holding a sealed letter he would not let Wren read, and said, "I am not sending you to an easy situation. I am sending you to a possible one. There is a difference, and the difference matters." Wren had thought she understood what that meant, standing in Boston with Silas Drummond's threats still hanging in the air like weather. Sitting now in a dead woman's room, on a dead woman's bed, under a dead woman's unfinished cross, she understood it differently, more completely. She stood, removed her coat, and began to unpack her bag. Dinner that night was simple and quietly extraordinary. Stew from a pot that had been simmering since morning, venison, root vegetables broth, dark and rich from long cooking. Fresh bread from that afternoon. Coffee so strong it was almost a solid. Thad brought her a bowl and a cup without being asked, and Cormac and Rafe sat across from her, and nobody said anything for a while, which should have been good and was not. They ate, the fire burned, snow ticked against the window glass. "You came a long way," Rafe said eventually. "Not a question, not quite." "I did." "Sister Honora's letter said your lungs were poorly." He looked at her steadily across the table. "They don't seem poorly to me." She met his gaze. "They're not." No. He picked up his coffee cup. I didn't think so. Another silence. Cormac was watching her from across the table with those amber eyes that seemed to operate several layers deeper than most people's eyes did. He did not speak immediately. When he did, his voice was even without accusation or edge. You're running from something, he said. It was not a question either. Wren set down her spoon. She had decided somewhere on the mountain trail that these men had earned directness. They had come for her. They had put themselves between her and Boyd Reardon without knowing a single thing about her. They had given her a room and a meal, and they had done it without the quality of expectation she had learned under Silas Drummond to identify immediately. Someone, she said, a man named Silas Drummond. He was my guardian after my parents died. He has money and influence in Boston. He wanted to marry me, or more precisely, he wanted my inheritance, and marrying me was the legal mechanism for obtaining it. Wanted, Dad said. Past tense. Careful. I left before he could complete the arrangement. She folded her hands in her lap. He'll look for me. He has the resources for it, but he doesn't know where I am yet. Yet, Rafe said. Yet. Cormac looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, he will not come onto this mountain without answering for it. The simplicity of the statement was what struck her. No elaboration, no performance of menace. Just a fact being stated by a man who found facts sufficient. She believed him, not because she was naive. That innocence had been educated out of her with enough thoroughness that she was not likely to repeat the lesson. She believed Cormac Calloway because she had spent enough years in close proximity to a man who made threats he never fully intended to carry out, and this was not that. This was a man telling her what the world was actually going to look like to the best of his knowledge and ability. After dinner, Rafe produced a harmonica from somewhere and sat near the fire and played. The tune was slow and wandering, neither happy nor sad, exactly something in between, something that sounded like landscape rather than emotion, like the sound of a long trail and the quality of evening light on snow. Wren sat across the room and listened and felt for the first time in 3 years that she might sleep tonight. She did not sleep. Not immediately. She lay in Ivy's bed in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about the name carved above the door and the unfinished cross on the wall and the closed sewing basket in the corner. She thought about 3 men on the other side of a thin wall, their voices too low to parse their presence, filling the space between them like heat from a banked fire. She thought about Boyd Reardon's pale eyes at the edge of the street and the way he had looked at her not like a man warning a woman, but like a man marking a territory. She thought what happened to Ivy Calloway, not how did she die. She had asked that and received half an answer. What she wanted to know was something more specific, more textured. What was she like? What did she make of 3 men? What did 3 men make of her? The fire in the main room had burned down. The harmonica had stopped. She could hear distantly the sounds of the brothers settling in for the night, the creak of floorboards, the weighted silence of large men trying to move quietly. Then silence. Real silence, the kind that is only possible at altitude, at distance from everything human. The snow had stopped. The pines were still. Wren lay in the dark and listened to it. After a while, she got up. Not to leave, not to find anyone. She did not fully understand what was pulling her to her feet, only that it was the same instinct that had always led her toward knowing, rather than away from it, the same instinct her father had called her best quality, and Silas Drummond had tried to punish out of her and never fully succeeded. She lit the oil lamp on the dresser and turned it low. She looked around the room, the herb jars, the quilt, the cedar cross, the brush on the dresser. A woman had lived here for years. A woman had moved through this space every morning and every evening had slept under this quilt, had looked into the small mirror, had laid her hands on these things daily until they became simply the texture of her life. And then she had not. Wren crossed to the corner. She stood in front of the sewing basket for a moment, her hand on the lid, knowing that what was in a person's sewing basket was private, personal, not meant for other eyes. Knowing also that Ivy Calloway had been dead for 8 years, and whatever privacy she had carried with her was beyond violation now, because death does that. It is the need for privacy, even as it makes the impulse to respect it feel more acute. She lifted the lid. Needles thread in a dozen colors carefully wound. Scraps of fabric. A pair of small scissors with handles shaped like a bird. And on top of everything, a piece of embroidery in progress, a cover for the cedar cross on the wall, she realized worked in blue and gold thread, a pattern of vines and leaves half finished. The needle still threaded, still in the fabric, as if the woman who had been stitching it had set it down to do something else and simply never came back. Wren looked at it for a long time. Then she looked beneath it. The basket had a false bottom. She almost would have missed it if the edge of a leather strap had not been visible where it met the wicker side of the basket just slightly, like something tucked in haste rather than design. Her fingers found the latch. The bottom lifted. Beneath it lay a small journal bound in dark leather, tied with a piece of cord. The leather was soft, with handling the cord worn at the knot from being tied and untied many times. Wren lifted it. She stood in the lamplight for a moment, the journal in her hands, looking at the window, where the darkness outside was the profound dark that only exists far from other people. She knew she should put it back. The same instinct that had made her open the basket told her clearly and without ambiguity that what she was holding was not hers and that there were good reasons for that. She also knew she was going to read it. She sat on the edge of the bed, turned the lamp slightly higher, and opened to the first page. The handwriting was small, and even the letters precise and well-formed. She read. The early pages were what she expected, and also somehow more than she expected. A woman writing to herself about the life she was living, the work and the cold and the light on the mountains, and the quality of loving three men who were the same person and entirely different people simultaneously. The writing was not elegant in any literary sense, but it was honest in a way that took her breath slightly, in the way that purely honest things sometimes do. She read for a long time. The lamp burned steady. She did not hear the snow begin again outside. She was near the end of the journal when the entries changed. The first one was dated September of 1869. It read, Boyd came to the cabin again while the brothers were checking the upper trap line. I asked him to leave. He didn't argue. But he stood at the door for too long before he went looking at me in a way I have learned to recognize. I have not told Cormac. 3 pages later, Boyd has written me a letter. It was waiting at the general store when we went down last week. I burned it without reading all of it, but I read enough. He says I am wasted here. He says I belong to one man, not 3. He says it like it's a truth I've somehow failed to see. He has not yet understood that it is not a failure I need correcting from. Then Boyd took my arm at the edge of the south meadow today. He squeezed it hard enough to bruise. He said he was trying to make me understand. I don't think he knows the difference between understanding and submission. I think he has decided they are the same thing. I must tell Cormac. I keep telling myself I must tell Cormac. Then near the very end, the handwriting changed slightly less, even as if written in haste or agitation. I saw Boyd at the tree line this morning, just standing, watching the cabin. His face from that distance was unreadable, but his posture was the posture of a man who has decided something and is no longer in negotiation with himself about it. I must tell Cormac tonight. When he comes in from the barn, I will tell him everything. If something happens to me, if by some... The entry stopped, mid-sentence, mid-thought. Wren turned the page. Blank. She turned it again. Blank. The rest of the journal was empty. She sat for a long time with the open journal in her hands and looked at the last line Ivy Calloway had ever written and felt the cold come through the window glass against her face and understood something with absolute clarity. Boyd Reardon had stood at the edge of the street and told her the Calloway brothers were not natural. He had looked at her with those pale, calculating eyes and tried to warn her away. Not because he was concerned for her, because she was in a room that had been his obsession, because she was sleeping in a bed belonging to a woman whose last written words were about him, because 3 men on this mountain had been carrying guilt for 8 years for something that was not their fault. And because Boyd Reardon, who had tried to take what he wanted and failed, who had come to the edge of this property and watched and calculated and waited, had looked at her today with the specific focus of a man who was already beginning to wonder whether history might be willing to repeat itself. Wren closed the journal carefully. She retied the cord. She placed it back beneath the false bottom of the sewing basket and lowered the embroidery over it and set the scissors and the thread back in their places and closed the lid. She sat on the edge of the bed in the lamplight with her hands folded in her lap. Outside, the snow was falling again, soft and steady and patient, covering tracks, filling in the places where things had happened and making them look from a distance like nothing had happened at all. The mountain did not care, but Wren Whitfield did. She turned down the lamp until the room was dark and lay back on Ivy's quilt and looked at the ceiling and listened to the silence and thought about what a woman does when she is carrying a truth that could destroy the people around her and has not yet decided whether the carrying of it is a burden or a weapon. She thought about it for a long time. Then just before dawn, for the first time in 3 years, she slept. January came the way January always comes to the high country, without announcement, without ceremony, with simply a deepening of everything that was already there. The cold got colder, the silence got quieter. The snow, which had seemed in December like it might eventually stop, revealed itself in January to be a permanent condition of the world rather than a passing one. Wren had been on the mountain for 11 days when she understood that surviving here was not going to be a matter of endurance. It was going to be a matter of knowledge. This realization came to her on a Tuesday morning when she went to collect eggs from the chicken coop and came back empty-handed because she had approached too quickly and startled the hens and spent 15 minutes trying to calm them down and then given up. She stood in the yard with her breath making clouds in the air and her hands cold through her gloves, and the feeling a person gets when they discover that the thing they assumed was simple is in fact a skill. Rafe was splitting wood near the barn. He had been watching from the corner of his eye, which she had learned was how he watched most things, never directly, always from an angle the way you look at something bright, so it doesn't blind you. "You're thinking about it wrong," he said without stopping his rhythm. "Lift, swing, the wood split clean. Show me." He looked at her then, direct for once. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration of whatever he had been expecting her to say. He showed her. "You move slowly," he explained. "You let them see you coming. You don't reach, you wait. You become part of the space until they forget to be afraid of you. And then you take the egg and you say thank you," which sounds like a foolish thing to say to a chicken, but Ivy always said it, and the hens were better behaved for it. "So there it is." He said Ivy's name without flinching. Wren noticed that. She had been noticing over 11 days the different ways the three brothers carried that name. Cormac did not say it at all. Thad said it occasionally carefully, the way you set a fragile thing down. Rafe said it the most often, and when he did, it was always direct without softening, as if he had decided that gentleness toward the word itself was a form of dishonesty about the grief. She went back to the coop. She moved slowly. She waited. She said thank you. She came back with 4 eggs. Rafe did not comment on this. He simply nodded once and went back to his wood, and that was the end of it, which was she was coming to understand exactly how he expressed approval. The days took on a structure, not one imposed by the brothers. They had not laid out a schedule or a set of expectations or made any formal statement about what her role in the household was going to look like. The structure emerged the way structure always emerges, in places where survival is a daily project, rather than an abstraction from necessity, from repetition, from the logic of what needs doing, and who is best positioned to do it. Mornings, Wren woke before the brothers and built the kitchen fire up from coals and started coffee and collected eggs and fed the chickens and thought about Ivy's journal. She had not read it again since that first night. She did not need to. The words had settled into her, arranged themselves into knowledge she carried now the way you carry a stone in a pocket, always aware of the weight, always knowing it's there. Late mornings, Rafe took her outside and taught her the physical vocabulary of this life. How to split wood without wasting the swing. How to read snow for depth before you stepped into it. How to move through the pines in winter without breaking crust and making noise that carried. How to check whether ice on the water barrel had gotten thick enough to need breaking and how to break it efficiently. He was not a patient teacher in any conventional sense. He did not repeat himself. He did not soften instruction, and he had absolutely no interest in pretending that she was doing something well when she was not. But he was precise, and he was consistent, and he was underneath the directness genuinely invested in her getting it right. She figured that out around the 5th day. By the 8th day, she had stopped needing him to tell her when she had made an error, because she had developed enough judgment to know it herself before he said anything. Afternoons, Thad taught her the interior arithmetic of a mountain winter. Which provisions to use first and which to hold in reserve. How to make broth from bones that had already been boiled once. How to identify the herbs on Ivy's shelf by smell, when the labels were too faded to read. How to maintain the cast iron stove so it didn't rust. How to keep a lamp burning longer by trimming the wick at precisely the right height. He was a different kind of teacher than Rafe, patient, methodical, happy to explain the reason behind a thing rather than just the thing itself. He talked to her like someone who found her capable of understanding complexity, which was, she realized, not a thing she had experienced with any regularity since her father died. Evenings, Cormac. He sat with her after dinner by the fire, and he did not teach her anything practical. He talked to her about ideas, about Thoreau and self-reliance, about the ethics of a life built outside the machinery of civilization, about what it meant to make your own rules when the rules you had been given didn't fit the life you were actually living. He talked like a man who had been having these conversations mostly with himself for 8 years and had a considerable backlog. She pushed back when she disagreed with him, which was often. He welcomed it without making a performance of welcoming it. They argued quietly in the firelight about Whitman and about property law and about whether a person could be said to owe anything to a society that had never asked their opinion before making its demands. She did not know in those conversations what she felt about Cormac Calloway. She knew it was something she was not ready to name. What she knew with more certainty was what she felt about the situation itself, which was this: for the first time in 3 years, she was spending her days becoming more capable rather than less. Silas Drummond had understood intuitively that a capable woman was a dangerous woman, and he had managed her accordingly, restricting her movements, controlling her information, keeping her in a state of deliberate dependency. Every day on this mountain was the reversal of that. Every egg collected, every log split, every proper broth made from nearly nothing was a small piece of herself she was recovering. She was not doing it to become a better wife. She was doing it so that she would never again be in a position where her survival depended entirely on the mercy of another person. She thought about Ivy every day, not obsessively, not with the quality of haunting. More the way you think about someone who left you an inheritance you didn't ask for, with a complicated gratitude, with the responsibility of knowing that what you were given cost someone something real. She thought about what the journal had told her and what it had not. What it had told her, Boyd Reardon had loved Ivy Calloway with the ruinous intensity of a man who had confused obsession with devotion and was not capable of understanding the difference. He had watched her, followed her left, her letters grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise. He had understood that she had chosen 3 men over him, and he had not been able to stop trying to revise that choice. What it had not told her what had happened on the morning of December 24th, 1869. Not precisely. The last entry ended mid-sentence. The rest was silence and 8 years of 3 men blaming themselves for something that was not their fault. She knew with the certainty of a person who has been close enough to controlling men to understand their logic what had happened. She knew it the way you know the end of a story you've heard the beginning of too many times. Boyd Reardon had gone to Ivy that morning. He had made one last argument. Ivy had refused him the way she had always refused him, because she was a woman who knew her own mind and had never apologized for it. And Boyd Reardon, who had confused wanting something with deserving it, had done what men like that do when the world declines to arrange itself around their desires. She knew all of this. What she did not yet know was what to do with the knowing. The weeks between Christmas and the New Year did something to the 4 of them that none of them named aloud, because the naming of a thing changes it. And what was happening between them was better left to grow in its own time without the pressure of language. It started as most real things do, without announcement. One evening in the first week of January, when the fire had burned low and Thad had already gone to bed and Rafe had gone out to check on the horses in the cold, Cormac stayed at the table after dinner instead of moving to his chair by the fire. He simply sat there, his coffee cup empty, and Wren sat across from him, and they talked until the candle burned to nothing. Not about Thoreau this time, not about property law or the philosophy of self-reliance, about her father, about the Greek he had taught her, about the way certain words in ancient languages carry meanings that modern ones cannot quite hold. She did not know when she finally stood to go to bed that she had been sitting there for 3 hours. What happened after that was gradual and honest and mutual, and belonged to the 4 of them in the same private way that the cabin belonged to them, not spoken of to anyone outside, not performed, simply lived. She had come to this mountain afraid of being used. What she found instead was the surprise of being chosen every day by people who could have chosen otherwise. By the middle of January, she had stopped sleeping in Ivy's room. The room itself she kept as it had always been: the quilt, the herb jars, the sewing basket in the corner, the unfinished cross on the wall. She had not moved anything, but she had begun leaving the door open in the mornings, which none of them had explicitly acknowledged, and which had simply become the way things were. The 26th of January was her birthday. She did not tell anyone. She lay in the darkness that morning, 21 years old as of the previous midnight, and calculated what that meant. Under the terms of her father's will, which Silas Drummond had spent 3 years manipulating and misrepresenting, she had been his legal ward until her majority. His guardianship had been the instrument of everything: the locked doors, the controlled meals, the threats about debtor's prison, the insistence that she had obligations she had never agreed to. All of it rested on his legal authority over her as a minor. That authority had expired at midnight. Silas Drummond did not know that. He was still in Boston, or perhaps somewhere on the road west, operating on the assumption that she was his to retrieve. He had sent Ward Garrett. She had not yet encountered Ward Garrett, but she understood from the brothers' conversation one evening that Drummond employed a man by that name to handle matters that required discretion, and Ward Garrett would be coming, and when he came, he would come with legal language and a mandate to return Drummond's ward to her rightful guardian. Except that she no longer had a guardian. She was legally completely in every jurisdiction that existed her own person. Silas Drummond would not learn this until it was too late for it to matter. She held that knowledge in the dark on the morning of her birthday, like a card she had not yet decided when to play. She said nothing. She got up and built the fire and made the coffee. Thad figured it out first. He noticed, because Thad noticed things the way water finds the low point in a room without effort, as a simple consequence of his nature, that she had been slightly different in the kitchen that morning. Not happier, lighter maybe, as if she had set something down. He brought her a mug of coffee, and he looked at her for a moment, and he said quietly so the others wouldn't hear, "How old are you today?" She looked at him. 21, she said. Something moved across his face, not celebration exactly, more like the expression of a man who has just understood several things simultaneously and is arranging them into order. "Does Drummond know?" "No." Thad nodded slowly. He turned his mug in his hands. "That changes things. The legal standing. If his guardianship is ended, he has no claim," she said. Not in any court, not in any territory." She paused. "But he doesn't know that. And a man like Drummond, knowing and not knowing, makes the difference between a man who accepts the situation and a man who makes a problem of it. So we let him not know. Until it's useful for him to know." Thad was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that quality of attention that she had come to think of as his most honest expression, the look of a man who was actually seeing rather than simply looking. "You're not what Sister Honora's letter described," he said. "No." "She knew that when she wrote it." "Yes," Wren said. "She did." He almost smiled. "Good," he said simply, and went to check on the stove, and neither of them said anything else about it. Ward Garrett came on a Tuesday in the second week of February. Wren was hanging laundry on the line strung between the cabin corner and the nearest pine, a task she had adopted because it was necessary, and because there was something meditative about it: the cold air and the wet fabric, and the focus required to do a simple thing properly when she heard the hooves. She heard them before she saw anything. Sound carries differently at altitude, and in snow, bouncing off the ridge lines in ways that make distance difficult to judge. She stood still for a moment listening, and then she saw the horse coming up the last section of the trail into the clearing. One rider. Well-dressed for the terrain, which meant he had been told what to expect. He had the look of a man who did work that required both physical capability and a certain amount of plausible deniability, lean professional with eyes that moved across the clearing and cataloged everything in it before they settled on her. He dismounted. "Miss Whitfield," he said. She did not move from where she was standing. She had a wet shirt in her hands and she held it. Her heart was doing something loud and rapid in her chest, but her face was doing nothing at all, which was a skill he had developed in 3 years with Silas Drummond and were very glad of now. "Mr. Garrett," she said, because she knew who he was. She had been expecting him. Something flickered in his eyes, surprised that she knew his name, quickly controlled. "Mr. Drummond has been looking for you for some time." "I'm aware. He would like you to return to Boston, Voluntarily is the preferred method, but he authorized me to use whatever means are necessary to facilitate your return. He said it the way people say things they have been paid to say, without personal investment in the content. He has legal standing, Miss Whitfield. As your guardian. My guardian, she said. Of what standing precisely I'd be interested to understand the legal argument. Ward Garrett paused. He was a man who dealt in certainty, and she had just introduced a note of uncertainty, which was not what his script had prepared for. Under the terms of your father's ward, she said simply, because something had come into the clearing that Ward Garrett had not seen yet. He heard them before he turned, the soft percussion of 3 sets of boots crossing packed snow. He turned slowly with the careful movements of a man who knows better than to make fast gestures when he doesn't know what's behind him. Cormac, Rafe, and Thad stood at the edge of the clearing. They had come from the direction of the barn, which meant they had been inside and had heard the horse and had come out without a word, without discussion, as if the decision had already been made before the need for it arose. Rafe and Thad flanked Cormac, and all 3 of them were looking at Ward Garrett with expressions that contained no anger, no agitation, nothing dramatic. Just 3 large men in the cold giving a stranger their complete and unhurried attention. It was more effective than anger would have been. You're trespassing, Cormac said. Ward Garrett straightened. I'm here on behalf of Silas Drummond, whose ward is not here. Cormac's voice was even, flat. And the next time you come onto this mountain, you'll want to reconsider whether the wages cover it. A silence. Ward Garrett looked from the brothers to Wren and back again. He was calculating, she could see it, the arithmetic of risk and reward, of whether the money was worth what he was reading, in 3 identical faces. He made the sensible decision. He mounted his horse. He looked at her one more time before he turned. It was not a look of defeat. It was the look of a man filing a report. He'll come himself, he said, not a threat, a fact. Let him, Rafe said. Ward Garrett rode down the mountain. The silence after he left had a different quality than the usual mountain silence. Charged. Like the air before lightning, that kind of quiet that means something has been building for a while and has just announced that it will not hold much longer. Cormac looked at her. You knew his name. I heard you mention him a few weeks ago. He was quiet for a moment. He was doing what he always did, reading not just the surface of the thing, but the structure beneath it. You were expecting him. I was expecting someone. There's a difference between expecting someone and knowing what to do when they arrive. He was studying her face with those amber eyes that never quite let anything go once they'd decided to look at it. You didn't run. Running would have told him something useful. Standing still told him something more useful. Rafe made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood. Thad said nothing, but the look on his face was the look of a man who had already suspected something and was now confirmed in it. He'll go back to Drummond, Cormac said, and Drummond will come when the trail clears in spring. March, Wren said. March, he agreed. She nodded once. They all went inside. She told them about Silas Drummond that evening. Not everything. Enough. She told them about the 3 years of being watched, being controlled, being managed like livestock rather than a person. She told them about the threats, the debtor's prison, the assets, the way he had used her father's memory as an instrument. She told them about the night he had come to her room and pressed her against the wall and told her what she was going to do. She told them in a plain, even voice, without emphasis or embellishment, because that was the only way she could tell it, the same way she had always handled the things that had happened to her, which was to look at them clearly and refuse to let them grow larger than they actually were. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Rafe's jaw was hard. Thad was looking at the fire. Cormac had not moved from where he was sitting, but the quality of his stillness had changed. It had gone from its usual controlled patience to the patience of a man deciding what the right thing to do was before he did it instead of after. He won't leave this mountain the way he came up it, Cormac said. I know. She looked at him. But I need you to understand something. The situation is more complicated than it looks. Tell me. I turned 21 on the 26th of January. A silence. Thad quietly. His guardianship is ended. Legally, completely. But he doesn't know that. And when he comes into March, he'll come with the assumption that he has legal standing, that the law is on his side. If we take that assumption away from him before he's committed to something irreversible, The situation resolves differently than if we wait until he's already made a move. Cormac looked at her for a long time. You have a plan, the beginning of one. Tell me what you need. She took a breath. I need time, and I need you to not do anything impulsive before I've finished thinking. Rafe made a sound. You think one of us is the impulsive type. I think one of us is definitely the impulsive type, she said. Rafe opened his mouth and closed it again. Thad very carefully did not smile. Cormac's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. You have time, he said, and we'll hold. February deepened. The cold became less aggressive and more permanent, as if it had stopped trying to make a point and had simply settled into being the nature of things. The snow on the roof built up another foot. The water barrel froze solid twice in 1 week. The horses grew thick winter coats that made them look less like horses and more like some earlier, more elemental version of the species. Wren woke one morning in the 3rd week of February with her stomach wrong. Not wrong in a worrying way, wrong in a very specific, recognizable way that she understood immediately in the same wordless manner the body understands things before the mind catches up, because there were things women knew and passed on to each other, and she had been paying attention since she was old enough to understand that knowing was better than not knowing. She lay still for a moment. Then she calculated backward with careful arithmetic. Then she lay still for another moment. Then she got up and built the fire and made the coffee and said nothing to anyone because she needed to know first by herself what she thought about it before she introduced it into the air between 4 people in a small cabin in winter. She thought about it for 3 days. What she thought was this: she had come to this mountain running from a man who wanted to use her body as a legal and financial instrument. She had found in place of that 3 men who had never once treated her body as anything other than her own. She had found work that made her capable. She had found conversation that treated her intelligence as real. She had found in the slow accumulation of mornings and evenings and ordinary days something that she did not yet have the right word for, but that felt when she listened to the quiet like something she was choosing rather than something happening to her. And now, apparently, there was a child. On the 4th morning, Thad came into the kitchen and looked at her for a moment in the way he looked at things he was trying to understand. How long? He asked, quietly, so the others wouldn't hear yet. She looked at him. How did you know? The way you've been carrying yourself. You're protecting something. He said it simply without drama. I spent years watching Ivy move through this cabin. I know the difference. She let out a breath. 8 weeks, maybe 9. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face, something complicated, layered, not fully readable. Then he crossed the room and he stood beside her, and he said in a voice low enough that it was only for her, "This child belongs to all of us. Whatever comes next, you understand that. This is not a complication. This is ours." She had not known until the moment he said it how much she had needed to hear something exactly like that. She nodded once. "Tonight," she said. "We'll tell them tonight." That evening after dinner, she told them. Cormac went very still. Rafe stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room for a moment, and when he turned around, his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before. Thad was watching her face. "You're staying," Rafe said. It was not quite a crunch. "I was always going to stay," she said. "I just needed to finish deciding it." Cormac looked at her across the table. There was something in his face she could not entirely read. Relief was part of it, and something older than relief, something that had been waiting in him for a long time and was now carefully being permitted to exist. "Whatever Drummond brings in March," he said, "it will not touch you." She held his gaze. "I know, but Cormac, I need you to let me handle the first part of it. When he comes, before any of you do anything. Ren for him. He'll come expecting a ward, a minor frightened legally his. What he finds instead will be a 21-year-old woman with full legal standing and no obligation to him of any kind." She kept her voice steady. "That's a different confrontation than the one he's planned for. Let me have it first." The 3 brothers looked at each other. That thing passed between them that she had seen since the first day, the silent communication of people who have lived in close quarters long enough that language is sometimes just a slower version of understanding. Cormac nodded. "First," he said, "then us." On a morning in early March when the snow first showed signs of giving way at the edges, softening in the afternoon sun, pulling back from the south-facing slopes in thin strips of revealed brown earth, Boyd Reardon came to the cabin. The brothers were on the upper trap line, a 4-hour round trip they made every 10 days. Wren was inside making bread her hands in flour when she heard a single horse on the trail. She knew before she saw him. She wiped her hands on her apron and she stood in the kitchen and she breathed for a moment. She thought about Ivy's journal. She thought about a sentence near the end: Boyd is not a man who accepts refusal. He has decided that persistence and right are the same thing. She went to the door and opened it before he could knock. Boyd Reardon stood on the porch steps, one hand raised. In the winter light, he was older looking than he had seemed in December. The cold had gotten into his face in ways that cold does to people who spend too much time alone with something they can't resolve. His pale eyes found hers immediately. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Reardon." He looked past her into the cabin. Looking for the brothers, she understood, confirming they were not there. When his eyes came back to her, they had a different quality, more direct, as if the audience being removed had changed the nature of the performance. "I think we should talk," he said. "I think you should say what you came to say," she replied. She did not move from the doorway. She did not invite him in. He looked at her for a moment. The calculation in his face was visible now in a way it hadn't been in December, as if the winter had worn away some outer layer and left the mechanism beneath more exposed. "You found it," he said. It was not a question. She held his gaze and said nothing because silence was sometimes the most precise answer available. "Ivy's journal." He said the name with something in his voice she couldn't fully classify. Grief, she thought, but grief folded around something harder. "I looked for it after. I caught it and didn't find it. I thought she might have—" He stopped, reorganized. "How much did she write?" "Enough," Wren said. The air between them held still. Boyd Reardon looked at her, really looked at her. She felt for the first time past the calculating assessment he had offered in December and into something more unguarded. What she saw there surprised her. Not danger, though the danger was still present. Something underneath the danger. The expression of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and is beginning to understand that the weight is not going to get lighter on its own. "I didn't plan it," he said. "That morning." She waited. "I went to her. I told her—" He stopped again. The words were having difficulty in him, she could see, not because he was trying to hide them, because they were real, and real things are harder to say than performed ones. "She told me she would never leave them." She said it like it was simple, like I was simple for not understanding it. He was quiet for a moment. "I grabbed her. I wasn't thinking about anything except that she was wrong, and I needed her to know she was wrong. And then she hit her head." "She didn't hit her head," Wren said quietly. The silence that followed was complete. Boyd Reardon looked at her, and something in his face broke in a way that faces break when a version of reality they've been maintaining for years finally gives way. "No," he said. "She didn't." Another silence. "I've lived with it for 8 years," he said. "Every day." He looked past her again at the cabin, at the name above the door. She couldn't see from where she stood, but knew was there. "And every day I've watched those 3 men blame themselves for something that was—" He stopped. "Yours," Renan said. He nodded, once, like a man who has finally said the true thing and has nothing left to say after it. Down the mountain, just at the edge of her hearing, Wren heard horses. Multiple horses. Not the brothers, they were coming from the wrong direction from below, rather than above from the trail that led down to Pine Ridge, rather than up to the trap line. Silas Drummond. He had come in March as she had known he would, with men and legal authority, and the assumption that she was still his to retrieve. She could hear them on the trail below, working their way up through the softening snow, probably 6 riders from the sound of it. She stood in the doorway of the Calloway cabin with Ivy's journal sitting on the kitchen table behind her and a child growing in her body and a confession still hanging in the cold air between her and the man on the steps. She looked at Boyd Reardon. "I need you to decide something," she said. "Right now, before they get here." He looked at her. "You've carried this for 8 years," she said. "You came here today, and I believe you when you say it wasn't planned, because a planned conversation doesn't look like this one. You came because it's gotten too heavy to hold anymore." She paused. "There are 3 men on this mountain who have spent 8 years believing they failed her, who have lived with that guilt like it was a sentence they deserved. You can keep letting them serve it, or you can do the one thing that actually costs you something. His pale eyes held hers. Below them, the sound of horses was getting closer. The judge is in Pine Ridge until the end of the week, she said. I know this because Thad told me last Monday, and I remembered it because I remember things that might be useful. She looked at him steadily. Drummond has done this before. 3 women before me. 2 of them are dead. I know this. The people in this territory don't know it yet, but they could. Something shifted in Boyd Reardon's face. She pressed on because the horses were close now, the sound of them clear in the softening morning air. Drummond is coming up this mountain to take me back. He believes the law is on his side. If someone had evidence that it isn't, if someone had spent the last several weeks gathering information about a pattern of behavior that a territorial judge would find very interesting. She stopped. Let the shape of the thing be clear without filling in every line. That would change the nature of this confrontation considerably. Boyd Reardon looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached inside his coat and withdrew a folded envelope. She looked at it. I started looking into him when his man Garrett came through town asking questions. He said something about the way he was asking them. I've known men like Drummond before. He paused. I found the records in Denver. 3 previous wards. 2 dead within a year of marrying him. A housekeeper in Boston who remembers a great deal about a locked room, and a girl who came to dinner with bruises on her wrists. He held out the envelope. I arranged to meet the judge at the base of the trail this morning before I came up. He and the men from Pine Ridge are waiting at the tree line. I told them I needed to speak with you first. She looked at him. He had come today not only to confess, but to make one last reckoning possible, the confession first before the legal business, because the confession mattered more to him than the outcome. She took the envelope. That's not absolution, he said. What I did to Ivy, I know that. No, she agreed, it isn't. Below them at the bottom of the final approach to the clearing, the horses emerged from the trees. Silas Drummond rode at the front. She recognized him immediately, the expensive coat and the upright bearing, and the expression of a man who is accustomed to the world arranging itself in accordance with his expectations. Behind him came Ward Garrett and 4 other men, all armed. Wren stood in the doorway of the cabin with the envelope in one hand and the full knowledge of her 21 years and her legal freedom and her child and everything she had spent the winter becoming. And above them, just appearing over the ridge from the direction of the upper trap line, 3 large men on horseback moving down toward the clearing with the unhurried speed of people who understood that something had happened and were coming back. She turned and picked up Ivy's journal from the kitchen table. She held it in her other hand. She stepped down from the porch and walked to the center of the clearing, and she stood there in the snow in the soft March light and waited for Silas Drummond to come to her. Not the other way around. That distinction mattered. She had spent 3 years going to Silas Drummond when he called. She would not take another step in that direction for the rest of her life. Silas Drummond rode into the clearing like a man who had never once been told no and did not intend to start receiving it today. He was exactly as Wren remembered him, tall in the saddle, expensive in his coat, with the kind of bearing that comes not from confidence, but from the lifelong assumption that the world is organized around your comfort and inconvenience belongs to other people. He had a lawyer's face, precise, controlled the expression, arranged to communicate authority, rather than to reflect anything actually happening inside. His eyes found her immediately. They moved briefly to her stomach, then back to her face. She watched him register the information and file it. Whatever calculation he made in that moment, she could not read it, but she saw him make it. He dismounted without hurry. Ward Garrett and the 4 other men stayed on their horses, spread across the clearing entrance, in a line that was meant to communicate something. She understood what it was meant to communicate. She was not impressed by it. Drummond walked toward her across the snow. He stopped 10 feet away. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time anyone had called her that in months. She had been Wren since Boston. Wren since her mother named her for the small brown bird that sings louder than its size suggests it should be able to. Only Silas Drummond insisted on Eleanor, and he insisted on it for the same reason he insisted on everything, because the choice of what to call a person is a quiet form of ownership, and he had never stopped believing she was his. Mr. Drummond, she said. He looked at her for a moment. She could see him taking inventory of the changes in her. The way she stood, the fact that she had not moved when his horse entered the clearing, the fact that she was standing in the center of the open ground rather than pressed against the cabin door. He was a man who read situations carefully before he spoke, which had always been one of the things that made him dangerous. He understood nuance. He understood posture. He understood that the position of a body in space communicates as much as any word. He understood she could see that she was not standing the way she used to stand. You've put us both through considerable inconvenience, he said. The U.S. was deliberate the suggestion that her suffering was equivalent to his, that her escape had cost them equally. She had heard him use that construction 100 times in 3 years. It had never been accurate, and he had always known it. I apologize for any inconvenience on your behalf, she said. I'm afraid the inconvenience on mine was less avoidable. His expression tightened barely. You're coming back to Boston. There's nothing to discuss beyond the logistics. There's quite a bit to discuss beyond the logistics, actually. She kept her voice level and conversational, the way you speak to someone when you want them to understand that you are not afraid before they have the chance to decide whether to try to make you afraid. Starting with the legal standing on which you believe you're making this request. I am your guardian. Were, she said. Past tense. I turned 21 on the 26th of January. Your guardianship ended at midnight on that date. You have no legal claim to my person, my location, my decisions, or my assets, such as they are given your management of them. She paused. I want to be precise about that because I understand you value precision in legal matters, and I'd hate for there to be any confusion about where we stand. The silence that followed had a specific texture. Drummond looked at her. Something was moving behind his eyes. The rapid recalculation of a man who had come up a mountain with one hand of cards and has just been shown that the deck has been reshuffled. He was not a man who panicked. He was a man who pivoted. Your age doesn't change the nature of what you took from me, he said. 3 years of room and board. The costs of your upkeep were covered by my father's estate, which you liquidated. She had been waiting for this argument. She had prepared for it the way you prepare for weather you know is coming, not by hoping it won't arrive, but by building something solid enough to stand in it. I have a sworn statement from your former housekeeper in Boston regarding the conditions of my residence in your home. I have letters from 2 of the 3 previous women who served as your wards and survived the experience. I have records from the Denver Territorial Office documenting the circumstances of the deaths of the other 2. She held up the envelope. I have this. Drummond's face went still in a way that was different from its ordinary stillness. The stillness of a structure that has encountered something it wasn't designed for and is deciding whether to hold. And she said, I believe you'll find that the territorial judge currently in Pine Ridge will find the contents very interesting. He's there until the end of the week. We have time. She heard from the direction of the upper trail the sound of 3 horses coming down the ridge. She did not look. She knew who it was. She needed to finish this part before they arrived because she had asked Cormac to let her have the first part of this and she intended to use it. You have nothing, Drummond said. His voice had gone cold in the way that revealed finally what had always been underneath the careful surface, the thing that had pressed her against a wall at midnight and told her what she owed him. A delusional girl's allegations, the word of a dismissed servant. Whatever these mountain animals have told you about yourself. Mr. Drummond, the voice came from the tree line to the left. Not Cormac. Softer than Cormac, with an edge underneath the softness that was the edge of a man who has decided something and is no longer debating it. Boyd Reardon stepped out from the trees. He was not alone. Behind him on horseback came a man in a dark coat with a badge on his lapel, the territorial judge from Pine Ridge. A compact man in his 50s with a weathered face and the careful eyes of someone who has spent decades being asked to determine what is true and has developed strong opinions about what that process requires. Beside him rode Silas Garrett from the general store and 2 other men from Pine Ridge that Wren recognized from the day she arrived. Drummond stared. I've been in Pine Ridge for 2 weeks, Boyd said. He walked to Wren's side and stood there, and she understood that he was not standing there for her protection. She did not need his protection, but as a witness. as a man placing himself in the geography of the situation in a way that could not be misread. Talking to people, writing letters, waiting for the judge to ride in. He looked at Drummond with those pale eyes that had, over the course of a single winter morning, lost most of their calculation and gained something more direct in its place. Turns out that when you start asking the right questions in the right places, Silas Drummond is a man with a great deal of history. The judge dismounted. He looked at the envelope in Wren's hand. "Is that the documentation Mr. Reardon referenced?" "Yes," she said. She crossed to him and handed it over. He opened it. He read. He was not a man who read quickly. As a performance of intelligence, he read carefully the way someone reads when they intend to be responsible for what they've understood. It took several minutes. Nobody spoke. Ward Garrett on his horse at the clearing entrance had gone very still. When the judge looked up, he looked at Silas Drummond. "I'm going to need you to come down to Pine Ridge with me," he said. "There are questions that need answering." "This is an outrage," Drummond said. The composure was cracking now in the specific way that composure cracks in men who have always used it as an instrument of control, rather than a reflection of actual equanimity. "I came here to retrieve my ward, who left my home without permission." "This woman is 21 years of age," the judge said. "She is not your ward. She has not been your ward since January, and the questions I have for you have nothing to do with her." He folded the papers back into the envelope. His voice was not raised. It did not need to be. "Mr. Drummond, I am asking you to come with me. I will ask once more before I stop asking and start instructing." The four hired men looked at each other. Ward Garrett very quietly walked his horse out of the line and to the side, which was the professional's way of communicating that his involvement in this situation had reached its conclusion. Silas Drummond looked at Wren one last time. She had expected in this moment to feel triumph, or relief, or the release of a pressure that has been building for years. What she felt instead was simpler and less dramatic than any of those things. She felt the same thing she had felt on the morning of her birthday, lying in the dark, calculating her own freedom, a kind of quiet, solid clarity. The sensation of a person who has been standing on uncertain ground for so long that they have forgotten what certain ground feels like, and then finds it and simply stands on it. "Eleanor," he said, one last time. The word was habit, possession by reflex. "Wren," she said, quietly, without anger, just the fact of it. He turned and mounted his horse and rode toward the judge and the men from Pine Ridge, and the line of hired men parted to let him through, and then they followed because there was nothing else for them to follow, and within a few minutes the sound of the horses had faded down the mountain trail and was gone. The clearing was quiet. Wren stood in the March snow and breathed. Behind her she heard 3 horses come the rest of the way down from the upper trail and into the clearing. She heard them dismount. She heard boots on packed snow crossing toward her. She did not turn around yet. She needed one more moment in which the thing that had just happened was only hers before it became the property of the story they were all in together. Then she turned. Cormac was closest. He had stopped a few feet away, and he was looking at her with those amber eyes that had always seen more than she fully showed, and what was in them now was not relief exactly. Though relief was part of it, it was something more complex. The expression of a man who has watched someone do something that required a specific kind of courage and is trying to find the right response to it and has come up empty. He said nothing. Rafe was behind him, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen from him. All the calculations stripped away, just the man inside, which was a considerably softer thing than the outside suggested. Thad had seen her face first, and he was watching not her, but Cormac, the way he often watched Cormac, with the careful attention of the one who holds things together, when the one who holds things together is close to not holding. Boyd Reardon stood at the edge of the clearing. He had not moved toward her or toward them. He was standing in the posture of a man who has done a necessary thing and is now waiting to find out what it costs. Cormac saw him. The change was immediate and physical. The stillness he had been carrying since he rode into the clearing became a different kind of stillness. The stillness that precedes movement, that is not peace, but its exact opposite. The coiled quality of something about to release. His jaw went hard. His hands at his sides became fists. He took one step toward Boyd. "Cormac!" Wren moved. She was between them before the second step happened. not because she was fast, but because she had been ready for this, and he had not known she was ready. She put her hand flat on his chest. He was like putting your hand against a stone wall, immovable, solid, radiating heat from the containment of whatever was happening inside. He looked down at her. "Let me tell you something first," she said. "Ren, first," she said, "you told me I had the first part. Give me this one too." He held her gaze. Something moved behind his eyes, the effort of it, the active work of choosing not to do the thing the body had decided it was going to do. His jaw was still hard. His hands were still fists. But he stopped. She turned to Boyd. Boyd was looking at her with those pale eyes that had, over the course of this morning, lost most of the qualities she had identified on that first day in Pine Ridge as predatory and gained something else in its place. Underneath everything, simple exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something at full weight for 8 years and has just set it down and is not yet sure whether the relief is worth what the setting down required. "Tell them," she said. Renard Cormac said again from behind her. His voice was different now, warning and question at once. "Tell them what you told me," she said to Boyd. "All of it." Boyd looked past her at the three brothers. He looked at Cormac, specifically at the man whose wife he had killed, at the face that was the same as the other two faces, and somehow also the face that had carried more of the weight of it, 8 years of it, the guilt of the one who had loved her first and longest and found her face down in the snow and carried her back and believed for 8 years that he had failed to protect her. Boyd opened his mouth, and he told them. He told them about going to Ivy that morning, about what he had said to her and what she had said to him, about grabbing her in the struggle and the sound she made when she fell. He told it without softening it and without elaborating it, in the flat, careful voice of someone who has rehearsed this confession in their own heads so many times that the telling of it has worn the words smooth like stones in a riverbed. He told them what he had done after, how he had left, how he had come back to the clearing in the afternoon with the others, pretending ignorance, watching Cormac carry her inside. He told them all of it. When he finished, the clearing was so quiet that Wren could hear the snow softening in the noon sun, the barely audible drip of melt from the pine branches, the sound of the mountain doing what mountains do, which is continue regardless. Rafe made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound of something tearing low and involuntary, the sound a person makes when the thing they have been braced against for years finally hits, and the bracing turns out not to have been enough. That had gone very still. Cormac. Cormac's face had done something she had never seen it do. The control that years built, carefully maintained containment had simply stopped. Not broken dramatically. Stopped the way a clock stops. Like the mechanism had received something it wasn't built to process and had paused to reckon with it. He walked toward Boyd. Wren did not step in front of him this time. He walked to Boyd Reardon, and he stood in front of him, and for a long moment he said nothing and did nothing, and Boyd did not move and did not speak. Boyd was doing what a man does when he has genuinely accepted what is coming to him, the absolute stillness of someone who has stopped negotiating with consequences. Cormac's fist came up. It connected with Boyd's jaw in a single clean strike, and Boyd went down in the snow and stayed down on one knee, his hand pressed to the side of his face. And then Cormac stood over him, breathing, and did not hit him again. The restraint cost him something visible. She could see it in his shoulders, in the rigid line of his back, in the way his hands hung at his sides. He stood there for a long moment. Then he said in a voice that was very quiet and entirely controlled, and more dangerous for both of those things, "You let us believe it was our fault. 8 years. You let us carry that." Boyd looked up at him from the snow. "Yes. She was alone. She was afraid, and you left her there." "Yes." The silence stretched. "I loved her," Cormac said. The words came out stripped of everything but the fact of them. Not an explanation, not an argument, just a thing that was true and needed to be said in the presence of the man who had ended it. "She was the best thing in my life, and you ended her, and then you let me believe I could have stopped it." Boyd said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. He seemed to understand this. Wren watched Cormac stand in the snow, with 8 years of grief and guilt moving through him like weather through an open country. Rafe had come to stand beside his brother and then Thad on the other side, and the three of them were standing over Boyd Reardon like three versions of the same reckoning, And it was Thad who finally spoke. "If you kill him," Thad said quietly to Cormac, "you spend the rest of your life being the man who killed Boyd Reardon. You spend the rest of your life being what he is." He paused. "Ivy loved you. She loved all of us. She would not want her death to make you into something she would not recognize." The words landed. She could see them land, could see Cormac receive them, and work with them the way he worked with everything carefully, without rushing, with the patience of a man who has learned that the first response is not always the right one. He looked down at Boyd for another long moment. Then he stepped back. "Get up," he said. "You'll go down to Pine Ridge with the judge. You'll tell him what you told us, all of it." He paused. "You did one decent thing today. Don't make it the last one." Boyd got up from the snow. He wiped blood from the corner of his mouth. He looked at Cormac and then briefly at Wren. What passed across his face then was too layered to name guilt and grief, and something that might have been underneath everything, a species of relief. The relief of a thing finally being over, even when over, means accountability. He nodded once. He walked to his horse. He rode down the mountain. After he was gone, nobody spoke for a while. They stood in the clearing in the March sun and let the silence do what silence does when it follows something real, which is hold it. Give it the space it needs, not rush past it toward whatever comes next. It was Rafe who moved first. He walked to the tree line and stood there with his back to the clearing and his shoulders moving with breathing that was not quite controlled. Thad went to him and stood beside him and did not say anything, which was the right thing because there was nothing to say. Cormac came to stand beside Wren. He did not touch her. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold air, and he looked out at the mountains, at the ridge lines and the pines and the vast indifferent white of the high country that surrounded them on every side, and he breathed. 8 years, he said, quietly, just the two of them. I know. I thought every day there was something I should have done, should have gone with her, should have been watching, should have known she wasn't safe. He stopped. Should have known he was that kind of man. You trusted someone, she said. He violated that trust in the worst possible way. That's not a failure of judgment. That's a sin on his side of the ledger, not yours. He was quiet. Ivy knew, Wren said. She wrote about it in the journal. She kept saying she needed to tell you. She was trying to protect you from what would have happened if she'd told you and you'd gone after him. She was protecting you right up until the end. She paused. That's not a woman who died because the people around her failed her. That's a woman who died still trying to take care of the people she loved. Cormac turned to look at her. She met his eyes. She deserves to be remembered that way, Wren said. Not as someone you have failed to save, as someone who loved you completely enough to try to protect you even then. Something in his face shifted, moved. The way a landscape moves after long rain, not dramatically, not all at once, but fundamentally, so that what you're looking at is the same terrain and also different, has new channels in it, new places where things can flow that were blocked before. He reached out and took her hand. His was large and warm and calloused, and entirely careful the way it had always been since the first moment he had offered it to her on a snowy street in Pine Ridge on Christmas Eve. She let him hold it. They went inside. Thad made coffee. Rafe sat by the fire for a while without speaking, and then eventually got up and did something useful with his hands, which was how he processed everything, by finding a physical task to carry the weight of whatever he was working through internally. He split wood that didn't need splitting and stacked it against the wall with more precision than was strictly necessary. And when he came back inside, he looked lighter. They ate lunch in the quiet of people who have passed through something together and are still in the feeling of the passing, not yet arrived at the talking about it. In the afternoon, Cormac said, I want to see her. Wren looked up from the mending she had given her hands as occupation. The grave, he said. He was looking at the cedar cross on the wall of the room with the open door of that cross with its unfinished cover, the needle still threaded. I want to go up there. We'll all go, Rafe said. They put on their coats. The grave was on the hill behind the cabin, where the aspens grew. Even in winter, the aspens were beautiful, their white bark and bare branches making a tracery against the sky that was delicate and precise, nothing like the heavy furred weight of the pines. Someone years ago had cleared a small space between two of the largest trees and the marker was there, a piece of smooth slate hand engraved. Ivy Calloway, beloved, 1869. The snow around it had been visited recently. There were compressed boot prints from multiple sets of feet. She understood that they came up here regularly, had been coming up here for 8 years, and that this had been private to the three of them in the same way that the journal had been private to Ivy. Something that existed outside of language in the territory that grief occupies when it has been living inside people long enough that it stops being an event and becomes simply a quality of the air. They stood around the marker. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Cormac said, "She would have liked you." Wren looked at him. "Ivy, she would have seen you the first day and known exactly who you were." His voice was even, carrying only what it meant to carry. "She was like that. She read people. She saw through everything. All the surface, right to the actual person underneath." He paused. "She would have had your measure inside the first hour, and she would have approved. I'm certain of it." "I feel like I know her," Wren said. "From the journal, from the room, from the cross she was making." She looked at the marker. "I want to finish it." Rafe looked at her. The cross, the embroidery, the cover she was making for it. "I found it in the basket. It's half done." She paused. "I don't want to presume, but I think it should be finished. It should exist the way she intended it to exist." The three brothers looked at each other. Thad said, "She'd want that." Yes. Rafe nodded once. Cormac looked at the grave for another long moment. He said quietly, not quite to any of them, more to the aspens and the slate and the cold March air, "You can rest now. We know what happened. We know it wasn't what we thought. And she is one." He stopped, started again. "Wren is here, and the child is coming, and I think," his voice broke once cleanly. He stopped, breathed. "I think we are going to be all right." The aspens moved slightly in the wind. The snow settled around the marker. She did not know if what she felt in that moment was sorrow or its exact opposite, because those two things live so close together in certain moments that the distinction stops being meaningful. She knew that she was standing on a hillside with three people who had been broken and were in the process of becoming unbroken, and that she was part of that process, and that the process was also simultaneously happening to her. She had come to this mountain running from something. She understood, standing at Ivy's grave in the March light, that she had not been running toward nothing. She had been running toward the configuration of people in place that constitutes, when you find it, what your life actually is. You don't always know when you're running that there's a destination, but sometimes there is. They were married in Pine Ridge on the third Saturday of March. The circuit judge had other business in the territory, but arranged for a justice of the peace, a compact, practical woman named Dorothea Avery, who had been performing marriages in Pine Ridge for 15 years and had long since stopped being surprised by any of the configurations the human heart chose to arrange itself in. The town came, not because they had been formally invited. There had been no invitations. They came because Pine Ridge was small, and news moved through small places the way water moves through porous rock, finding every available channel. And what had happened on the Callaway Mountain in March had been the most interesting thing to happen in the territory in several years. They came also, Wren thought, because frontier people had always had a pragmatism about survival and the choices it required, and they understood, even those who raised an eyebrow, that a woman alone in the world and three men alone on a mountain had found each other and made something workable, and workable in hard country was its own form of the admirable. Legally, she could only sign one name. She signed Cormac's. But she spoke her vows facing all three of them, which Dorothea Avery permitted, with the expression of a woman who had seen enough of the world to understand that the law and the truth were sometimes in a different room. She wore a white dress that Thad had sewn, altered to accommodate the gentle curve that was their child, visible now when she stood in certain light. She had pinned her mother's cameo at her throat. Her hair was loose the way she wore it in the mornings when the day was not yet public, because she wanted to be herself in this moment, in the most complete sense of the term, not performed, not arranged, just present. She held Cormac's hand, and she looked at the three of them, and she said the words. She promised to stay. She promised to be honest. She promised, in her own modification of the standard language that Dorothea Avery accepted with one raised eyebrow and a nod, to be a partner and not a possession, and to expect the same in return. Rafe's eyes were bright. He was looking at her with that unguarded expression she had come to think of as his most true face. All the calculations stripped away, just the man inside, which was a considerably softer thing than the outside suggested. Thad was watching her with steady amber eyes and a slight curve at the corner of his mouth that was for Thad the equivalent of a broad smile. Cormac, holding her hand, was very still, but it was his best stillness, not the effortful stillness of a man managing his own interior, but the deep, easy stillness of something at rest, like a fire that has found its right size and is simply burning. The town witnessed. Silas Garrett from the general store whooped at the appropriate moment, and nobody told him to stop. October arrived, and the world turned gold. The aspens on the hill where ivy was buried went yellow and luminous, their leaves catching the late light in a way that made them look lit from within. The air had the clarity of high country autumn, sharp and clean, that made distant ridgelines look close enough to touch. Wren had stopped splitting and needed wood in September on the advice of no one in particular, and the collective silent agreement of three men who had begun in the final months of her pregnancy to arrange themselves around her with a protectiveness so instinctive it seemed like weather. She had finished Ivy's embroidery in August. The cross now hung on the wall of the room with the morning window, the one where the cedar cross hung with its new cover of blue and gold, thread vines and leaves complete. At last the needle finally set aside. She had matched the thread colors as closely as she could from what remained in the basket. The pattern was not exactly what Ivy had intended. She couldn't know what Ivy had intended, but it was finished, and it was careful, and it was done with the same quality of attention that the beginning had been done with, which felt like the right kind of respect. On the 1st of October at 4 in the morning, she woke Cormac. She was very calm about it. She had been afraid of this 4 months in the abstract way. You are afraid of something large and inevitable that you have no control over. And what she found when it actually arrived was that the fear had been replaced by something more purposeful, a quality of total focus on the task at hand, because there was no room in labor for abstraction. Thad took over. He moved through the cabin with the quiet efficiency of a man who has delivered animals in the dark in winter and understands that a living thing coming into the world requires two things above all else: patience and calm, and that panic on the part of the people attending serves no one, least of all the one doing the actual work. Cormac held her hand. He held it for 7 hours without complaint, which was notable because Wren was not gentle with it during the harder parts. She told him this afterward. He said he hadn't noticed. She did not fully believe him. Rafe paced the main room for the entire 7 hours. She could hear him through the wall, the steady circuit of boot on floor one end to the other, and back like a man who can convert worry into motion and has chosen that conversion as preferable to any of the other available options. The child arrived at 11 in the morning, a boy. Thad put him on her chest and she looked down at him, red-faced, furious at the indignity of being outside entirely himself from the first second, and felt something that was too large for any specific word. He had a scattering of dark hair, and when he eventually opened his eyes, they were amber. The warm amber of whiskey held up to firelight, which were the only eyes she had looked into daily for the better part of a year, and which looked on this new small face both utterly familiar and entirely new. There was no way to know which of the three brothers had given him those eyes. It did not matter. It had never mattered. Thad had told her that on the morning she told them she was pregnant, and he had been right, and the rightness of it was complete and uncomplicated and needed no further discussion. "What do we call him?" Rafe asked. He was standing in the doorway of the room, taking up most of it, his expression entirely undone in the way she had only seen twice before. She looked at Cormac. He looked at the baby. "Michael," he said, the name she had told him weeks ago that her father had loved, the name from a conversation by the fire about names and the things they carry. She had not expected him to remember it. She should have. He remembered everything. "Michael," she agreed. Michael Calloway opened his eyes and looked at the room and the people in it with the complete non-discrimination of the newly arrived, and in doing so looked at all four of his parents simultaneously, which was the most accurate thing he would do all day. The years that followed wrote themselves in the ordinary language of a life being lived in seasons, in harvests, in winters, survived in children fed and animals tended in arguments about how much salt was the right amount, that never arrived at consensus in books, read aloud by the fire and lessons taught at the kitchen table, and the slow expansion of the cabin to hold what the years kept adding. A girl came 2 years after Michael. Sarah, with her mother's winter wheat hair and her mother's quality of paying attention that looked like stillness, but was in fact its opposite. She was the one who noticed at everything and commented on it selectively, which was a more advanced social skill than most 2-year-olds possessed, and which she had fully deployed by the time she was 4. Then the twins arrived on a December night that Thad would describe afterward only as eventful. Callum and Amos, identical in appearance, opposite in temperament, together a force of nature that the older children had learned to monitor with the wary attention of people living near a small but unpredictable weather system. The cabin grew with them. Rafe framed a new wing one summer, and then another the next, and what had been a single room with a loft became a proper house, still built from the same dark mountain timber, still anchored by the great stone fireplace, but wide enough now for 4 children to run through without anyone getting knocked down. Usually. Pine Ridge accepted them over time. Not all at once, and not without the raised eyebrows and careful silences that accompany anything that falls outside the lines. But frontier people are at their core practical people, and the Calloway family was productive and honest and present when neighbors needed help, which counted for considerably more than the precise arithmetic of who slept where. By the time Michael was 5, they were simply the Calloways, the family up on the mountain known for good timber work and a willingness to help in hard weather, and 4 children who could ride before they could properly walk. The winter of 1888, Michael was 10. He had his father's broad build beginning to come in all 3 brothers, visible in his face at different angles, which was the genetic democracy of a child who had grown up belonging equally to all of them. He was serious like Cormac, and physical like Rafe, and perceptive like Thad, and entirely himself, which was the correct synthesis. Sarah was 8. She had her mother's winter wheat hair and her mother's quality of attention. She was already at 8 someone her brothers went to when they needed to understand something, which she found simultaneously flattering and exhausting, which was Wren thought exactly the right response. The twins Callum and Amos were 6, and they were 6 in the way that 6-year-old twin boys are 6, which is to say completely and without interruption. On a Saturday in December, Wren stood at the window of the main room and watched them in the snow below. Michael was teaching Sarah something that not she thought from the way they were working a piece of rope between them. Cormac's patience in Michael's hands. Callum and Amos were engaged in something that had the structure of a game and the quality of a dispute, shouting at each other in the amiable way of people who will be reconciled within minutes, regardless of how the current argument resolves. Outside the mountain, the same mountain, indifferent and enormous and present, that had been here when she arrived 11 years ago, on Christmas Eve, in a navy blue traveling dress with $20 hidden in her petticoat, and terror and determination in equal measure. The same pines, the same ridge lines, the same quality of silence that exists only at altitude and distance. She had been afraid of this place once. She was not afraid of it now. She was in the specific and earned sense of the word home. Cormac came to stand behind her. He was 43 and his hair had silver threading through the brown, and there were lines around his eyes from years of squinting into mountain light, and he was in every particular the man she had married, except that the grief she had first seen in him, that deep structural grief that had been the architecture of his face when she arrived, was gone. Not forgotten. Gone. Resolved into something else the way a wound resolves, leaving behind scar tissue that is tougher than what was there before. He put his hands on her shoulders. She leaned back against him. Callum is going to win, she said, watching the twins. Callum always wins, he said. Amos lets him. He figured out years ago it's easier. That's very strategic of Amos. He gets it from his mother. She smiled, felt him smile behind her. They stood like that for a while, watching their children in the snow. Rafe came in from outside, stomping snow from his boots, and looked at the window and at what they were watching, and went to the stove and poured himself coffee without saying anything. He stood at the counter and watched his family in the yard, with an expression that was for Rafe as close to peace as his nature could arrive. At not soft, not sentimental, but genuine. The real thing without decoration. Thad was at the table behind them, reading to himself from a book with a broken spine that he had read so many times the pages had gone soft at the corners. He looked up at Wren and Cormac at the window and at Rafe at the stove, and his expression was the expression of a man who has everything he needs in his immediate vicinity and is aware of that fact and considers himself correctly fortunate. Wren looked out at her children in the snow. She thought about a girl who had stepped off a stagecoach on Christmas Eve with $20 and a carpet bag, and the specific courage that comes not from the absence of fear, but from the decision that the fear is not going to be the deciding vote. She thought about what that girl had known and not known, had been and not yet been. She thought about Ivy Calloway, whose room she had slept in those first weeks, whose brush she had used, whose embroidery she had finished, whose grave she visited on the hill with the aspens every season without fail. Ivy, who had loved three men and been loved by them and had been taken before she was done. Ivy, who had left a journal in a basket with a false bottom, as if she had known somehow that someone would need it. She hoped Ivy could see this. The children. The cabin expanded now to hold them all solid and warm against whatever the mountain sent. The cedar cross on the wall with its finished cover, the vines and leaves in blue and gold, finally complete. The kitchen where four people cooked together and argued and laughed and made something real every single day. She hoped Ivy could see it and know that the thing she had loved had not ended with her death. It had changed and continued and grown into something she might not have imagined, but might have hoped for, which is sometimes the best that love can do, not survive intact, but transform into something that carries its shape forward in a different form. Behind her, Thad turned a page. Rafe refilled his coffee. Cormac's hands were warm on her shoulders. Outside, Michael successfully demonstrated the knot to Sarah, and she tied it correctly on the first attempt, and Callum and Amos briefly stopped their argument to observe this extraordinary development and then resumed it at precisely the same volume as before. The mountain held them all. The snow fell steady and patient, covering the world in white, making it look clean. Wren put her hand on the cold glass of the window and watched her children and felt in the deep, unhurried way that certain truths arrive when you have finally earned the stillness to receive them, not quickly, not with drama, but completely down to the bone, that she had been right to run and right to stop and right to stay. She had come to this mountain looking for a way out. What she had found was a way in into a life she had not known how to want, because she had not known it was possible to want it, into a love that was not simple or conventional or what any story had told her love looked like, but that was real and hers and held. She pressed her hand against the glass. The cold came through. She did not pull away. Outside, Michael called something to his siblings, and Sarah laughed, and the twins forgot their argument entirely, and all four of them ran in the snow in the fading December light, their voices carrying up the mountain and back, and the mountain as it always had received them and held them and continued.